Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, executive editor of TNSR. Mark Twain once said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The repetition of patterns of events and responses is one reason that scholars and policymakers often turn to the past for insight into how to best deal with contemporary challenges. It's also why classic works of history and strategy, such as Thucydides' The History of the Peloponnesian War, have become classic, and they remain relevant today. In this episode of Horns, Dr. Paul Edgar, Associate Director of the Clements Center at the University of Texas Austin, goes 1,000 years before Thucydides to find enduring lessons as told in an inscription on a statue from the 15th century BCE. While the name of King Adrimi and the great powers of Hatti and Mitanni may not be familiar to modern listeners, Edgar illustrates how the themes of strategy, alliance, and statecraft in great power competition are familiar and relevant to power struggles today. In addition to his role as the Associate Director of the Clements Center, Edgar is a 22-year Army veteran with multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan who commanded a battalion of the 3rd Infantry, better known as the Old Guard. He holds a PhD in Middle Eastern Culture and Languages from the University of Texas, Austin, and is also a philologist who is conversant and able to do research in multiple ancient languages. His research focuses on strategy in pre-classical antiquity. This talk was recorded at the Summer Seminar on History and Statecraft, sponsored by the Clements Center at the University of Texas, Austin, and held in Beaver Creek, Colorado. Let's listen in.
Thanks for attending this mandatory session. Diplomacy shaken, not stirred strategy in the 15th century BC. This may be new material, but I don't pretend to offer any new lessons. Okay, and that's, I think, one of the things that we propose in history or in the discipline of history. Sometimes we learn something new about the history we already know. Alternatively, we may learn something we already knew about history we didn't know, right? So this is that latter half. I'm not necessarily going to teach you a new principle of political or military strategy. In fact, I'm going to emphasize one that you're probably very familiar with, and I'll even mention a political scientist that probably everybody's familiar with. Certainly the political scientists will be, and the historians likely as well. By the way, you may not know this, but we are gathered here in the chapel of scholarly bloodletting. And I am standing here at its altar. If you know, you know. If you don't know, don't ask. But I'd like everyone to relax as much as possible while still maintaining just enough power on upstairs to absorb what it is that we're doing here. And sometimes learning is best done by means of intense, unrelenting focus. And this group really understands that. You do. But then sometimes learning is best done by means of passive, lighthearted, maybe even humorous, leisurely reception. And my session tonight is representative of that second kind of learning for this group for at least 3 reasons. And I'm not going to go into any of them because we don't have time. Okay? So suffice it to say that if you relax yet tune in, I expect that the things you know so well will illuminate this material that you don't know from Adam. And that's ancient Near East pun intended. And let me begin, though, with a digression that I've titled Brief History of the Title of this Presentation, and then I'll actually dive into the presentation. I first considered the title Diplomacy on Iraq because ancient diplomatic texts, as everybody knows, especially those that appear before what we are familiar with as the alphabetic script, they are almost always written on clay tablets. And as you know, clay tablets are really just soft rocks, so it's diplomacy on Iraq. Further, diplomacy on Iraq channels Ryan Evans' War on the Rocks, right, which we all are familiar with and fans of. It also channels the unspoken drinking theme that is so closely connected every year with this customary late night session at the end of a marathon day. So Diplomacy on Iraq seemed like a great title. But unfortunately, the Adrimi text that we're going to look at today is not a diplomatic text. So it's not actually Diplomacy on Iraq. It's a political biography. So Diplomacy on Iraq didn't quite fit the subject and political biography on Iraq didn't have the same ring. So as I was mulling this over, the title of my presentation, the mighty Clements Center staff was justly getting impatient because they needed to send the agenda to the printer. However, crucially, they really liked the drinking theme of Diplomacy on Iraq. Elizabeth, Amber, and Alex liked drinking themes, while they maintained control. So Amber suggested Diplomacy Shaken, Not Stirred. Not because it has anything to do with anything I'm saying, but merely because it's connected to drinking. And after some deep intellectual reflection, I thought that was fair enough because at the very least, the Adrimi statue has survived innumerable earthquakes in its 3,500 years. It's been shaken. And at least as far as I know, it's never been stirred. I'm not sure what it would look like if it was. So thus was born the title of my presentation, Diplomacy Shaken, Not Stirred, Strategy in the 15th Century BC. And I have never had a martini, and thank you, Alex, for bringing me one, okay? Oh, it's terrible. It's so bad. Wow, all right.
It's a live experiment.
So that's the history of the title. Come back next year if you want to hear the tale of the history of the subtitle. All right. So first, a little show and tell. Okay, now go ahead and refer to your handouts, and just the one with pictures. There are numbers at the bottom of your handout, so if you start with the one that has the number 1 at the bottom, you'll be good. Okay, so first, just let me describe the statue so that you understand what we're looking at. I'll describe the geography a little bit, and then I'll start providing a little bit of context before we move into the inscription itself. So first, you see the first picture there, Adrimi statue up in the top left-hand corner. That is made of 2 pieces. The statue of Adrimi, the king himself, and it's seated into the throne, which is a separate piece of rock. The Adrimi portion, the king, he is made of white magnesite, a very hard type of rock, and the whole thing together stands just about 3.5 feet high. Leonard Woolley, who was a British archaeologist, discovered it in 1937 during the Mandate period, and currently it sits in the British Museum. Now, if you look, it's not a great picture, but you can still pick it up. If you look at the next picture, the one with the title above it, cuneiform text highlight, you can see the lines of cuneiform, okay? Cuneiform is generally, not always, but generally written left to right the same way we read English. So you can see the lines of wedges, little wedge marks. So that's what it is that I've translated for you and that we'll discuss. So it's written across the statue in different places, and we have in this case, we have discovered the whole thing. There's no reconstruction. It's really a very nice text. Okay, so the script is cuneiform, as I mentioned. The language is what we call peripheral Akkadian, and that just means it's really 2 different languages. One, East Semitic Akkadian, and number 2, a dialect of Canaanite, which is a West Semitic language. So it's 2 languages kind of mushed together. This is a common inscription language. We don't think anybody actually spoke it, okay? But it's a very common inscription language for this era in the area that we are familiar with calling the Levant or northern Syria, etc. So it's the common writing language of this time in this area. Map number 1. So the first map on the bottom left. I just want to point out here the geography of the great powers. There are 3 great powers at this time: Egypt, Hatti, and Mitanni. And you can see there in caps where we are familiar with Egypt. Okay, you can see it written across the Sinai there. Egypt. That's where Egypt is. Not a surprise. Okay. The other great power I want to bring your attention to, you see Hatti written right in the middle of where Turkey is today. All right. And so Hatti was central and eastern Anatolia at the time. And they don't have hard borders. They, in their mind they do, okay, but they don't have hard borders, and they don't necessarily describe them the way we would imagine today. The other great power I want to draw your attention to is Mitanni, and that's right next to Hatti. And maybe a better impression of Mitanni would be what we consider Kurdistan today, right? It's not a formal, there's not a formal map, right, that delineates Kurdistan, but we all generally know where that would be. And that's more or less where the kingdom of Mitanni was. So that's sort of the great power geography of what we're dealing with right now. The next map, the lower right-hand corner, I just want to bring your attention to about 4 different spots on it in the top half. So you see Aleppo in sort of in the top quarter in the center. So Aleppo is where Idrimi is going to start. That's where his life begins. He then flees to Emmar, which is on the northern Euphrates, over to the if you're looking at the map, it's just slightly over to the right. He then goes to what he describes as Canaan, which is slightly south. It's not very far south. In fact, it'd be difficult for us to really delineate Canaan from much else. But if you see where Ugarit is on the coast, it's probably at least that far south, maybe a little further. But it's still, we're not talking great distances here. And then the last town that I'd like to bring your attention to is Alala. If you know what the Orontes River is, okay, you see it curves up kind of around the tidal Ugarit and then drops down. That's the Orontes River, and you see Alala right there about where the tip is. So Idrimi is going to go from Aleppo to Emmar to Canaan back up to Alala, right? And so just want you to have be familiar with that geography so it makes a little more sense. And then on the back side, only a quick comment. So the big tablet that you see is a diplomatic text. It's essentially an extradition treaty between Idrimi and a small kingdom that was to his northwest, called Kizzuwatna. So this is one of the reasons why we think we confirm that Idrimi is an actual person, actual ruler. We have other texts that corroborate his existence. And then the smaller text next to it is essentially a transaction, an economic transaction with Idrimi's seal. All right, so that's the show and tell, and so you can refer to those maps. Particularly, you can refer to those maps if they're helpful as we work our way through this. All right, so the Idrimi statue inscription is probably the earliest complete biography of a political figure that we have discovered to date. Written on a statue of the king sitting on a throne, the inscription is a chronological abridgment of Idrimi's political and military activities in the 15th century BC in the northern Levant. While we have more biographical information about the lives and acts of earlier political figures, the information about those figures is spread among many sources, requiring our synthesis in order to construct something that resembles a complete biography. In contrast, Idrimi's inscription presents a whole story by itself. It addresses his youth, his rise to power, his activities while in power, and implicitly his death. The last lines of the text are essentially a formulaic epitaph. It's not a comprehensive story by any means, but it's complete in the sense that it has a clear and intentional beginning, middle, and end. The advantage of an inscription like Idrimi's is that it provides access to a complete political story of a verified historical figure composed by his political and family associates, we expect, in their own words, from their own perspective. No synthesis from us. While telling us about Idrimi and his work, the inscription also exposes some of the things that the author or authors believed made for his successful strategy and statecraft in his milieu. Of course, a text like this also has its disadvantages. We cannot corroborate some of the historical assertions or most of the interpretive assertions. This is a common problem with most of pre-classical history. one of a favorite comment of mine, sort of in my academic lineage, and some of you are like, my academic lineage is the grant strategy program at Yale and things like that, right? Well, we have our own little academic lineages. One of our sort of great priests has a famous quote: "We are working without data," which is kind of like Frank's work on the nuclear topic, right? We are working without data. But this is a common problem with most of pre-classical and even part of classical history. And like many political biographies, it contains a hearty hagiographic predilection. Still, despite its complications, the political biography of Idrimi offers something for us to consider. It addresses perennial themes of strategy and statecraft, such as juggling political alliances, juggling political equities, forming optimal alliances, and the pursuit of certainty. For students of strategy as an object of study in and of itself, particularly the history of strategy, I have in mind Lawrence Friedman. The Idrimi inscription offers another advantage because it precedes by almost 1,000 years the textual evidence for self-conscious analytic discussion of political and military strategy. In other words, it's untainted by real or imagined classical or Western traditions. It's safe to say that Idrimi and his contemporaries were not influenced by Herodotus, Thucydides, or Sun Tzu, much less Machiavelli, Clausewitz, or Fukuyama. We can use material like this in order to see if there are characteristics of this thing or these things that we call strategy that appear before anyone speaks explicitly of strategy. Further, its antiquity can also serve as a useful yardstick for political and military thought that claims or aspires to be classical. For example, if we can see Machiavelli's ideas at work in Idrimi, maybe that's because Machiavelli was really onto something and is worth preserving. All right, at this point, let me briefly explain the international political scene of the 15th century BCE, and I've already given you the geography. During the 15th century, the three kingdoms of Egypt, Hatti, and Mitanni possessed the lion's share of influence over international politics. The new kingdom of Egypt was the largest and most powerful of the three, but its influence in the northern Levant was limited. Located much further from Idrimi's city of Alala than the other two kingdoms, Egypt's attention was constantly pulled in several directions. It had several other substantial interests and responsibilities in Africa, the Mediterranean, and I'm thinking of Cyprus, and Mesopotamia. Consequently, despite more than 20 documented military expeditions into the area in the 15th century, Egypt's practical influence over the northern Levant was minimal. So Egypt could go up there anytime they wanted. Nobody could defeat them, but then they didn't have any political staying power either. They were just too far away, or they chose. They had to make choices, and one of the choices that they made was not to remain up there in any kind of force. While smaller and less powerful than Egypt, Hatti and Mitanni were still quite potent. They actively and often dramatically influenced much of the northern Levant, especially the states that were closest to them and stuck in between. In the 15th century, Hatti and Mitanni were also partway through a centuries-long struggle for regional hegemony. In fact, the Idrimi inscription provides an interesting snapshot of one moment in their protracted competition. Usually it's Hatti consistently on top, but in this particular moment, it's surprising and interesting that they are not. King Idrimi's rise and reign occurred during this period among these three great powers. While Idrimi was undoubtedly aware of Egypt's lack of political staying power ensured that Hatti and Mitanni would be the most influential international powers at the time. Egypt does not even appear in the inscription. Alala's status, choices, and relative independence would revolve around its relationships then with Hatti and Mitanni. So there's lots more to know, okay, but that should be sufficient to at least get us through the reading. And now we will have, and I understand intentionally, because I know you have a lot of reading for this week, Some of you may have read the Adrimi inscription before now, but I intentionally set aside about 10 minutes for us to read it in here. It can be dramatic, but it does not have to be. So while this translation is my own, it has been informed by many earlier translations, of course. Additionally, I use one complete sentence from Jacob Lowenger's online edition on Orac, and two sentences from Greenstein and Marcus, 1976. Lowenger's sentence is a very nice rendering of the Akkadian, and the two sentences from Greenstein and Marcus fill in for lines that are currently indecipherable, but which, in my opinion, capture the spirit of what is probably going on in the text at that moment. The Adrimi statue inscription, draft translation by Paul Edgar. I am Adrimi, the son of Ili Elima, the servant of the storm god, Hebat, and Ishtar, the lady of Aleppo, my lady. Calamity occurred in Aleppo, the house of my father. So we fled into the presence of the people of Emar, the sisters of my mother, and we settled in Emar. My brothers, who were older than me, they settled with me. However, none of them remembered those matters which I remembered. I said, whoever is of the house of his father, indeed he is a great son, but whoever is for the sons of Emar, indeed he is a servant. I took my horse, my chariot, and my driver. I crossed into the land of the desert, and I entered into the company of the Suteans. I spent the night in my chariot among them. On the second day I set out. I went to the land of the Canaanites. I settled in the land of the Canaanites in Amia. In Amia dwelled the people who were formerly of Aleppo, of Nia, and of Ameh. They saw me, the one who was the son of their Lord. Then they gathered to me. It was there that I was raised in status. I settled in the company of the Hapiru for a long time, for 7 years. I released birds, I inspected lambs. Then in 7 years' time, the storm god returned to me, so I built ships. I loaded formations of Nulu soldiers onto the ships. I approached the land of the Mukishim by way of the sea, and I arrived on dry land in front of the Hazi mountains. I went up, and my land heard me. They brought goats and sheep before me, and within 1 day, as one person, the people of the land of Nihi and Ameh, the land of Mukish, and the city of Alala, my city, they had turned to me. My brothers heard, so they came to me. My brothers found relief with me. I guarded my brothers. Moreover, for 7 years, Paratarna, the strong king, the king of the armies of the Hurrians, made an enemy of me. In the 7th year, I wrote to Paratarna, the king of Umanmanda, and I spoke about the services of my fathers. When my fathers found relief before them, the Hurrians, and about our other affairs, concerning the kings of the armies of the Hurrians. It was good. Thus they established between them a strong oath. The strong king listened to what I said about the services of my predecessors and the oath that was between them. He respected the oath. He received my greeting gift for the sake of the matter of the oath and for the sake of our services. A lost house returned to him. I spoke to him regarding my case and regarding my loyalty, and then I was king. The kings to my right and to my left rose up against me, against Alala, for he had made me equal, like them. Just as they piled up my ancestors upon the ground, so I piled theirs upon the ground. In battle, I piled them high. I took an army, and I went up against the land of Hatti. I seized 7 cities, Pasahe, Damarutla, Hulahan, Zillah, Ai, Uluzilla, and Zaruna. I seized these cities, and I destroyed other ones. The land of Hatti did not assemble or come before me, so I did what I wanted. I took them captive. I took their property, their goods, their pilferable things. I divided it for the army. my auxiliaries, my brothers, and my friends. I took their weapons. Then to the land of Mukish I returned, and I entered into Alala, my city, with the captives, and with the livestock, and with the property, and with the goods, and with the pilferable things which were from the land of Hatti. I brought these things down. I had an estate built. I made my throne like the thrones of kings. I made my brothers like the brothers of the kings, my sons like their sons, and my companions like their companions. I settled the inhabitants who were in the midst of my land in their good dwellings. I settled those inhabitants who previously were not settled. I established my land, and I made my cities equal to those which came before me. Then I established the signs of the gods of Alala, like my fathers here before. So I routinely performed those prayers and offerings of my grandfather, which he had routinely performed. Then I entrusted them into the hand of Adu-Nerari, my son. Whoever tears down this statue of mine, may his descendants be subdued. May heaven curse his name. May the underworld take his descendants. May the gods of heaven and earth constrain his kingdom and his country. Whoever alters or erases it, may the storm god, the Lord of heaven and earth, and the great gods destroy his name and his descendants from the land. Sharuah, the scribe, the servant of the storm god, the sun god, the moon god, and Ishtar. Sharuah is the scribe who wrote the inscription on this statue. May the gods of heaven and earth cause him to live. May they guard him, may they be good to him. May Shamash, the Lord above and below, the Lord of ghosts, cause him to live. I reigned 30 years. I wrote of my service about myself. May others look upon the words which I wrote. May they pray on my behalf. So Adrimi's biography asserts that he began his adult life with little political power. He engendered influence among several domestic constituencies in different places as he worked his way back up to Alala. He sought and found favor with one of the region's great powers, and he went to war with the other great power. He defended his newly established kingdom against local threats, and he provided stability for many of those who lived in his realm. Adrimi produced more out of his situation than the beginning balance of power suggested was likely or possible. He successfully created political power and instituted a particular political order. And if that sounds a little bit like Lawrence Friedman, it's intentional, and I do cite my paraphrasing of his sentences, his two sentences there. If we accept the broad arc of the account, even if we are skeptical or merely ignorant regarding the veracity of many details, Adrimi's inscription offers insight into strategy and statecraft at work in the 15th century BC. Of course, Adrimi's biography reflects strategic decisions that are exclusively relevant to his moment in time. Today, for example, Syrian rebels in the same area don't need endorsement from Mitannian kings in order to create a new state. However, as I alluded to before, Adrimi's story also reveals perennial characteristics of strategy and statecraft, which do happen to be relevant to Syrian rebels, modern states, and most other political actors. I'll mention 4, but then I'm going to take a little time only developing the first. If for some reason we just move very quickly, and I don't think we will, then I'll go into some of the other ones. But I'll mention 4 and go into 1 in detail. And the first one is the one I'll expand in detail shortly. So Adrimi's biography bears witness to distinct, connected, yet dissonant political communities existing within a single international system. It reflects the immense and constant effort that's required to harmonize relationships among these political communities. Number 2, it demonstrates that geography matters greatly, but is not determinative. It illustrates the abiding tension between political agency and circumstance. And it hints that this tension between political agency and circumstance, this is the 4th thing that I think it identifies, that that this tension animates a similarly abiding human pursuit for certainty. And that's a very interesting one, and I'm sorry we're not going to go into that, but why are we here? We want our strategy to be more certain in the future, right? So Nedrimi had his ways of pursuing certainty. Okay, again, I'll elaborate on just the first of these, that there are distinct, connected, yet dissonant political communities. The political communities attested in the inscription influenced one another, but did not control one another, even in those cases where substantial differences in power prevailed. The support or opposition of one community did not necessarily produce a complementary reaction from the other communities. Edrimi had to handle each of these communities on their own terms, according to their own distinct rules, for his single end. The three political communities that appear in the biography are, number one, Edrimi's domestic, what I call Edrimi's domestic constituency. And this changes. He moves south, kind of collects some followers, kind of moves up the coast, loads his ships, moves up the coast, not very far. This is not a huge sea movement, but moves up the coast, collects more after he lands, and then eventually settles in Alala, in the city of Alala, and establishes some sort of domestic constituency. Number two, the second political community is what I'm calling a second political community, is a circumscribed community consisting of Alala and the two great powers, right? And this is sort of a triangle. You've got to make a decision. Relating one way to one power means you're going to relate another way to the other power, right? And that is separate, although influenced and connected to the others. And then the third community, a numerically larger, less clearly defined community consisting of Alala and its small state neighbors. Okay, so first, Edrimi's domestic constituency, quoting just a couple of lines. They saw me, the one who was the son of their Lord, then they gathered to me. A little bit later, I went up, and my land heard me. They brought goats and sheep before me, and within one day, as one person, the people of the land of Nehi and Amay, the land of Mukish, and the city of Alala, my city, they had turned to me. This community grows and changes over time. Taking the text at face value, it was very easy. However, I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that it probably wasn't this easy. But we don't know how hard it was. Simply the text makes it seem to be that this was the easiest one for him to work with. The second political community consisted of this political triangle that I described, the great powers, Edrimi, the ruler of Alala, and Mitanni and or Hatti, depending on who he decided to align with. At this particular moment, the great power of greatest consequence in that area was Mitanni, which simplified Edrimi's options about which great power he ought to align with. But even if his best option was clear, it was not necessarily easy to secure, to realize it. Quoting again, moreover, for 7 years, Paratana, the strong king, okay, this is the Mitannian king, the king of the armies of the Hurrians, made an enemy of me. And his work to connect with this king. And I spoke about the services of my fathers when my fathers found relief before them. So he's referring now to some relationship that pre-existed when his family was in Aleppo. When my fathers found relief before them, the Hurrians, and about our other affairs concerning the kings of the armies of the Hurrians, and it was good. Thus they established between them a strong oath. And his summary of it, really, a lost house returned to him, in other words, Edrimi's family, or his political, his polity, returns in a different form to become a vassal of Mitanni. I spoke to him regarding my case and regarding my loyalty, and then I was king. So several things in these lines are noteworthy. Gaining recognition from Mitanni was difficult work. We probably should not take the reference of 7 years literally. 7 was often used in the same way that we might use the term dozens or a lot. It took a long time. It took effort. It was not just tedious work. The interim was a dangerous time. While he was an enemy, Paratana could have killed Edrimi and destroyed Alala during any given campaign season. Domestic legitimacy, in other words, Edrimi's relationship to his domestic community, did not translate automatically into international legitimacy with a great power. So this reminds me a little bit of our discussion yesterday about Aguinaldo in the Philippines, right? And you can think of several others, right? Ho Chi Minh in the aftermath of World War II, and we could probably spend the rest of the night thinking of cases like this. And then this is also an interesting side note. Whether real or imagined, it's interesting that Idrimi is using history to convince Paratarna to recognize him and Alala as a vassal state, something like a protectorate. So Idrimi himself is an applied historian, perhaps. So Idrimi's alliance with Mitanni corresponded with war against Hatti, and I don't think we should make too much of this, but it does reflect a real commitment. Because if Idrimi had really gone into the heart of Hatti and done something significant, he would not have lasted. But it does reflect a real commitment. Even a moderately successful military campaign against Hatti's periphery demanded considerable resources and effort from something the size of a little more than a city-state. So the third political community consisted of neighboring rulers of small states and nomadic or unsettled groups such as the Hapiru. In the Idrimi inscription, members of this group make an antagonizing entrance following Paratarna's recognition of Idrimi, and quoting again, "The kings to my right and my left rose up against me, against Alala, for he had made me equal like them." So, Idrimi works for years to form a domestic constituency. Then after even more work, Paratarna appoints Idrimi as king in Alala, and this is actually a common thing. Somebody was a ruler in a place, and then they're formally appointed in some sort of different sense in the same place by a great power or a different great power, as it may be. Okay, so Paratarna appointed Idrimi as king in Alala, but then instead of recognizing his legitimacy, Idrimi's peers attacked. Although alliance with a great power conferred some stability, legitimacy, and protection, it was not always sufficient to ensure the viability of a small kingdom amongst hostile peers. In this case, an alliance with a great power actually seems to have provoked hostility from smaller neighboring rulers. So small states like Alala needed, independent of their great power relationship, to establish friendly relations with their neighbors or, alternatively, maintain a deterrent or defensive capability. So let me summarize this single point and punctuate it by referring to a political scientist that, I think everyone will be familiar with. So 3 communities, right? Domestic community, great power community, and neighboring peers. These 3 political communities, again, they were connected. They were clearly influenced. They clearly influenced one another. Idrimi's relationship with his domestic constituency influenced the range of options available to him as he engaged Mitanni. Likewise, Mitanni's range of options depended in part on whether or not Idrimi's domestic constituency was supportive and stable. At the same time, these political communities were dissonant. They did not judge political legitimacy according to the same criteria. Idrimi's good relationship with his domestic constituency did not necessarily constitute legitimacy in the eyes of Paratarna, nor did Paratarna's support automatically translate into legitimacy amongst Idrimi's small kingdom peers. Sometimes, and this is consistent, we see this in the rest of the documentation from the era as well, sometimes these communities reinforced one another, sometimes they tested and strained one another, yet the communities, their connection and their dissonance taken together operated within a recognizable international political system of states that use the same tools and institutions to pursue divergent aims. The effort required to harmonize relationships amongst these communities, even nominally, was immense and constant. The Idrimi inscription hints at this chore of statecraft when it describes the long process of building a viable domestic body and the similarly long process of transforming Paratarna from an enemy to an advocate. Leaders like Idrimi had a difficult, complicated, unforgiving job, and it's incredible, I think, that anyone succeeded. In the late 1980s, the political scientist Robert Putnam earned attention in academic and policy communities when he described his theory of two-level games, right? And he's only talking about one particular policy at one particular time. When conducting negotiations for international policy solutions, political leaders must find options that satisfy both international and domestic communities, which have very different rules and expectations. The Adrimi statue inscription contains insufficient data to demonstrate the validity of Putnam's theory in detail, and to be clear, that's not at all my point here. I use Putnam, who published his article in 1988, as a temporal comparison to Adrimi, which was written in about 1450 BC, simply to demonstrate that some challenges of strategy really are enduring. So the inscription underscores the perennial, enigmatic, and downright wicked challenge of harmonizing dissonant political communities over a long period of time regarding a myriad of issues. In fact, I'd assert that the Adrimi inscription, identifying at least 3 discernible political communities instead of Putnam's 2, illustrates a perennial challenge of strategy which exceeds two-level games. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.